hazards and hazard research. This is an absolutely fascinating area of geography. If, like me, your fascinations with perception. When we think of hazards, hazard means risk, and risk assessment is something geographers do a lot. Actually, just as a note, I should point out that most geographers, you're not going to find them in academia. They work for, for example, insurance companies. It's geographers that map out areas of risk. For example, where you can't get fire insurance, that's something that geographers would be mapping out. Because when you think about that's one of those spatial areas, that would be a region, areas that are fire prone. Statistically, where you have a persistent pattern of fires, would be an area where insurance companies don't want to give out fire insurance because they have to pay out. They're in the business of making money, not giving it out. So hazards research is something that is sort of one of the practical areas that geographers tend to be heavily involved in. This one reason why you don't see many geographers. You don't see a lot of geographers versus, say, sociologists or certainly psychologists or anthropologists, because most geographers are actually working in either the private or governmental sectors. In fact, at least at UH, which used to have a really good geography department when I was there, many of the folks that were in the graduate programs wouldn't even finish because you'd get recruited when you were finishing your master's, or a lot of the folks didn't finish their doctorate because they were hired. They were given a job and said, "Hey, no need finish. We need you now." Especially, for example, intelligence services, like the Stratford stuff you guys got. A lot of that's written by geographers. So hazards research is something that geographers have been involved in a lot, but it doesn't show up in articles. It doesn't show up in the press per se. It's just sort of like, well, this is considered a risky area for X. And it'll be geographers that generated that. When looking at this perceptual standpoint, Hawaii is one of the fascinating examples of this. The current discussion, for example, with homes on the North Shore where the beach is eroding and the homes are just, are going to fall into the water, and who's got to deal with it and stuff like that. When you think about it, one of the questions that doesn't get asked is, why would you build a house on a sand berm that's facing the ocean? And the reason was that in the American or Euro-American perception of the real estate is engineering and science can always figure out things. So you can put places where they shouldn't be. You can put homes where they shouldn't be because somehow there'll be some way to make sure that it doesn't happen. Of course, Mother Nature is pretty good at making sure it does happen. So when if you actually talk to folks on the North Shore, ironically, the folks whose houses are ready to fall into the ocean, they could sell those houses for big chunks of money. Other people are more than willing to buy them, but they don't want to move. And they're always like, well, maybe global warming isn't happening. Maybe this was just an unusual high surge. It's a once in a 50-year event. So therefore, I've got another 49 years. That's the way they see this. And they've got all these rationales that basically justify the choice that they're making. But if you actually look at it from a sort of pragmatic point of view, they're crazy. And a classic example, let's take a look at this very quick. I'm going to switch over here. Oops, hang on a second. Well, this was in the news a couple of years ago. If you remember when the rift zone lit up. Here you've got basically, Hilo's up over here, and then you're down to, this is all in Puna, Poho's over here. I've done a fair amount of research, not recently, but over the years. In fact, we did a lot of the work in Kaimu, Kalapana before they got swallowed up back in the day. In terms of looking at archaeological historical resources out there. And one of the things that really struck me from the first time I went out there in the mid-70s was that when you look at the USGS or the Geologic Survey maps, because back then that's all we had was paper maps, they actually had on there when the lava flows were dated from. And so you could actually look at this map and you'd actually be standing on this place. And you could see that the last time that the lava was there was, say, 1937 or 1954. And what was really striking even at the time, because I wasn't a geographer, I was just an archaeologist, was you could be standing in the middle of a subdivision of folks that were living out, down below Pahoa towards, Orchid Estates and those areas down there. And you'd be looking on the map and it would say, last lava flow, I think 1952 for a lot of that area. And it was, 1975. So that's only, 20 years later. And you're thinking, dude, why would you build your house on ground that's just barely cool? Why would you be allowed to build a house there in an area that basically had 20 feet of lava show up 25 years earlier? And the simple reason is that people just thought realtors figured they could just bulldoze roads out there and people would buy it. And people did because the property was so cheap, because most folks wouldn't build out there. One, because they could read a map, and two, because they couldn't get insurance for it. And now we saw that when the RIFs on a lot of these houses went up, is those folks didn't have fire insurance. And it wasn't that they forgot to get it, it's that they couldn't get it. So ironically, what happened is, at least in some cases, the state and the federal government had to subsidize and pay for the destroyed houses, even though they should have never been allowed to build them in the first place, because within a very short period of time, they are going to burn down. Everything in that part of the island is going to burn down. The oldest lava flow there, I think, is 1889. That's only one little piece. Where the FAA has their station near Orchid Estates, it's again part of the 1952 lava flow. Now the FAA doesn't care. It's just a radar installation. So they just pick it up and move it somewhere else, I guess. But for folks that have houses down there, they have the illusion that they're on rock, they're on solid surface, and it's got trees and stuff growing there, and therefore their house, and they can raise their kids and have generations in the home. It's the family home, when the reality is next time Kilauea gets bored, the rift zone pops up, thump, and they disappear just like they did a couple of years ago. And you end up with this sort of interesting, when you actually examine it in detail. One of my colleagues did over at UH, is this weird sort of juxtaposition of the fact that the government actually knows that all that area is going to get covered in lava within the next 100 years, and probably much of it in the next 20 or 30 years. That's not a maybe, it's a given. And yet the pressures from developers to build homes, and construction industry to get paid to put up homes, people want to have cheaper housing, and it's hell of a lot cheaper to live down there than it is say over in Waimea Town or Hilo, for example, not surprisingly. And so what you find is there's all these pressures for people to do things that really, from a common sense standpoint, are a really bad idea. And when you look at that, that is what we call hazards research. Because hazards research has more to do with the way people perceive risk than the reality of risk. A geologist will tell you, if you look at this map here, and this is a map of that area in terms of recent flows, the only area that's old is the purple. Oh, no, I take that back. A little bit of the bottom down there's 1820s, but everything else is, within the last 40 years. And so every time you let people build in there, you basically are guaranteeing that you're going to have to provide some sort of government subsidy, because they're going to get their homes back. If you're lucky, you don't lose any lives. But all that infrastructure, power, water, all the rest of the stuff that you put in there will be completely covered. And then you got to redo the whole thing all over. It's just like erasing a whiteboard and then drawing new stuff on it, knowing that you're going to have to erase the board again. Or in this case, Mother Nature's going to erase it for you. So looking at people's perceptions, not only the people that live out there, but also, the county of Hawaii, the state of Hawaii, federal services. Why doesn't FEMA, the Federal Emergency Group, just say, you cannot build there? This phenomenon happens all over the world. Here in the United States, you see it especially along major rivers like the Mississippi. People build in flood zones. The river floods every 7 to 10 years. Their house gets flooded out. They go and they rebuild. And they build exactly the same house. They don't raise the house up so it won't get flooded. They just replace the house. And again, in another 7 years, the house gets out again. In other parts of the world, Bangladesh probably most famously, you end up with thousands, and in some cases tens of thousands of people dying every year from manageable risk, in the sense that that this is going to happen. You have a history of it happening. You can even predict when it's going to happen next. And yet that doesn't change people's or even government's decisions about risk. They figure it's worth it, or they're going to chance it. Living out in this area is basically, if you think living in this part of the Big Island, it might as well just go to Vegas. At least Vegas, the statistical odds. Here in the Big Island, given the randomness of volcanic events, the only statistical odds is I can guarantee none of those homes will be around in 100 years. But I can't tell you when each home is going to disappear. But my guess would be, given the statistical numbers here, that we're looking somewhere between, if you had a home that you built in 2000, if it survives to 2035, I would be really surprised. And that's not prognostication. That's just looking at a map, and the reality of geologic events in a highly active volcanic system on an island. So hazards research is absolutely fascinating. It's a big area in geography. A lot of folks that work for the feds, like emergency management and National Park Service, a lot of those folks are involved in various versions of this. State offices invariably have a couple of folks, usually geographers, that do this. And this is one of the things to remember about geography. It's not one of those disciplines that's highly visible. It's not like being a psychologist. On the other hand, it's a good way to make a really good income, and they're pretty much invisible. And the private sector is most famous to be insurance companies, the most obvious users of all this stuff. So hazards research is a hugely important area in geography. And it's absolutely fascinating when you look at people's behavioral discussions. And we have so many examples here in Hawaii between, sea level rise, between, the tourism industry in Waikiki being all edged out about they're losing their beach, what's going to happen when it floods. I mean, dude, it's going to flood. It's basically, that's a mud flat. That's what it used to be. So it's all artificial. All Waikiki is basically, it's like Disneyland. None of it actually is. It's based on, geologic or even geographic reality. So it's a matter of when, not if. So then you get into this whole discussion about whose fault is it, who should do something, what should be done about it. The North Shore, the Big Island. I mean, it's just, the list goes on and on and on here. Not because we're especially unique. It's just that the differences, if you're in Southern California, one of the main ones would be fire. And yet you find people literally building homes in areas where literally the trees are just cooling down from the last fire that consumed their home. They brush off and they put another home right up in the same place. And you're sort of like, what part of that is rational? Well, it isn't necessarily, but perceptually, in terms of logic, if you ask them, they can actually give you reasons. Well, that was a 1 in 100-year fire, and last fire that happened here was in like 1920, so it's not going to happen again. If you know anything about stats, especially stats related to natural events, just because something took 50 years to happen last time doesn't mean it's going to be 50 years before it shows up again. The lava flows in the Big Island don't work on a calendar. Oh, it's Thursday, it's 2024. I got to turn this vent on so you will flood this area. It doesn't work that way. You can have areas that, we know, for example, one area of the Big Island, you had 3 lava flows within 15 years. Each could be considered a once in 100-year event. That's not how they worked out. So